Here is something that almost nobody says out loud about the Vietnam War. For most of that war, an American soldier was far more likely to end up in a hospital bed because of something invisible than because of anything the enemy did to him. Not a bullet, not a mine, a mosquito, a cup of water, a wet sock worn 3 days too long. The men knew it. They talked about it constantly because it was the thing that actually happened to them and to the man next to them over and over, month after month. The Army knew it too, and spent an extraordinary amount of effort and money fighting it, and won some of those fights and lost others. But it never made the films. There is no scene in any movie where the climax is a young man losing a week of his life to a fever he caught from standing in the wrong puddle. That is what tonight is about. The quiet things, the ones that were in the water, in the air, in the mud, in his boots, in the food, and in the small hours when he could not sleep. The ones that were, very slowly and very patiently, trying to kill him the entire time he was there. It is a long list. We are going to go through it without hurrying, one thing at a time, and I am going to keep my voice down while we do it. There is nothing here you need to remember. If you fall asleep at the mosquito, you will not have missed anything, because the water is still going to be there tomorrow night, and so am I. One small thing before we begin, and then I will not interrupt you again. Tap the like button and subscribe while you are still awake enough to do it. And leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from tonight. I read every one of them. It helps this channel more than you would think. Thank you. Now put the phone down, so get comfortable. Turn the light off if it is still on. Let your shoulders come down away from your ears. We will start with the smallest one. The most dangerous living thing in Vietnam weighed about 2.5 milligrams. Malaria is carried by a mosquito, and the mosquito that carries it in that part of the world does its work at night, and it is not the loud one that whines in your ear. The species that matter are quieter and lower and prefer the hours between dusk and dawn, which are exactly the hours when a man in the field is lying still on the ground, in the open, unable to move, unable to swat, and often unable to cover himself, because covering himself would mean rustling. So the arrangement was perfect from the mosquito's point of view. Every night, for a year, a supply of warm, still targets, delivered to the tree line and told not to move. The parasite does something specific and awful inside the body, and I am not going to describe it in detail tonight, because this is not that kind of program. What matters for our purposes is the shape of what it does. A man gets it. Nothing happens for days or weeks. Then he is suddenly, comprehensively ill, in a way that puts him flat on his back for a stretch of days, and then he improves. And then, in one of the two common forms, it can come back later, weeks or months afterward, sometimes long after he has gone home and become a civilian again and stopped thinking about any of it. The Army's answer was chemical, and it was taken on a schedule. There was a large tablet given once a week. Units administered it on the same day every week, so that nobody had to keep track, and that day was traditionally Monday, which gave it the name every veteran of that war still uses, the Monday pill. It had a reputation, and the reputation was earned, and it was digestive. A meaningful share of the men who took it spent the following day regretting it, in a way that was neither dangerous nor dignified. And because young men are young men, a certain number of them quietly stopped taking it, which is why, in a great many units, the pill was handed out by a sergeant standing at the end of the chow line, watching each man put it in his mouth and swallow. Picture that for a second. Grown men, armed filthy, carrying more weight than most people carry in a lifetime, lining up to be watched, taking their medicine like children at a school nurse's office, and the sergeant doing the watching who did not enjoy it either, but who had seen what happened to a platoon that lost 6 men to fever in the same week. There was a second drug, taken daily rather than weekly, used in some units and some periods, and there were mosquito nets, and there was repellent. The repellent came in a small plastic bottle, and the men called it bug juice. It smelled sharp and chemical. It dissolved certain plastics if you were careless with it. It burned in a cut, and it worked well enough that men carried it religiously and reapplied it on the hour. It also got onto their hands, and from their hands onto their food, which meant a great many meals in that war tasted faintly of insect repellent and were eaten anyway. The nets were a different story. A mosquito net is a wonderful thing in a base camp with a cot and a frame to hang it from. In the field, in the dark, on the ground, with the requirement that you be able to get up and move in 3 seconds, it is a bag you are voluntarily climbing into. Some men used them anyway. Others decided that a fever in 3 weeks was a problem for a future version of themselves, and lay down in the open and were bitten 100 times before dawn. The medical statistics of that war are dominated by this, not by the dramatic, by the mosquito. Whole units were pulled out of the field, not because of what happened in a firefight, but because too many men had a temperature. There is something quietly humbling in that, and it is true of nearly every war anybody has ever fought. The insect wins more often than the army does. It has simply never had a good publicist. Now the water, which we touched on last night, but which deserves its own hour, because water was the second front, and it never let up. A man in that climate, moving, carrying 60 or 70 pounds, needed an enormous amount of water, far more than he could carry, which meant that at some point on nearly every day he was there, he had to take water out of the ground. A stream, a river, a paddy, a bomb crater with rainwater standing in it, a village well, a ditch, and the water in all of those places contained, in varying amounts, everything that lives in warm water in a place where several million people and a great many animals also live. So every man carried iodine, small bottles of purification tablets, 2 tablets to a quart, then shake, then wait. The waiting was the part nobody liked, because you are thirsty now, and the water is right there in your hand, and it is already water, and your body does not accept the argument about waiting 30 minutes. Men waited anyway, mostly, and then drank something that tasted like a swimming pool with a coin in it, when they did not wait, or when the tablets had run out, or when the bottle had been lost, or when the water was so bad that iodine was not enough. They got sick, and the illness that followed was the least dignified thing in the entire war and the most common. I am going to be delicate about the mechanics. What matters is the effect. A man with that illness is losing fluid faster than he can replace it, in a climate that was already taking it out of him through his skin, while carrying weight, while walking, while being unable to stop when he needs to. It empties him. It makes him weak in a way that is different from tiredness. And in a group moving through difficult ground, a man who is emptying out is a problem for everybody, because the group moves at the speed of its worst member, and the worst member cannot be left. The unit-level answer was a large rubberized bag hung from a tripod called a Lister bag with taps around the bottom. Fill it, treat the whole bag at once, and let men fill canteens from the taps. In a base camp, it worked well. In a fire base, it worked well enough. In the field, it did not exist. And in the towns, in the bars, at the stands outside the gate, there was ice. Cold drinks, poured over ice, sold cheap, and the ice was made from water that had been treated by nobody at all. Men knew this. They bought it anyway, every single time, because it was cold, and because nothing else in that country was, and they paid for it 2 days later. There is a lesson somewhere in there about how a body will trade its future comfort for immediate relief, and how completely reasonable that trade feels in the moment. But we are not here for lessons. We are here to lie still and think about small things. The heat did not feel like an enemy at first. It felt like weather. Then a man put on a helmet, a flak jacket, a shirt, trousers, boots, and 60 pounds of equipment, and walked uphill through vegetation that blocked every breath of moving air, in a place where the temperature sat in the 90s and the humidity sat near the top of the scale, and the heat stopped being weather and became a thing with intent. Sweat is the body's cooling system, and it only works if the sweat evaporates. In humidity that high, it does not evaporate. It sits on the skin and runs and soaks the clothing, and does almost nothing, which means the body keeps producing more of it, chasing a result it cannot get, spending water it does not have. A man in that state can lose a remarkable amount of fluid in a single day, and with the fluid goes the salt. Salt loss is the part people forget, and it is the part that puts men on the ground. The symptoms arrive quietly. Headache first, then cramps in the legs and the hands, the kind that lock a muscle in a position you cannot argue with. Then a sort of gray confusion where a man stops making sense and stops being able to say clearly what is wrong with him and simply sits down. The army issued salt tablets, and for most of that war they were everywhere, in bottles at the water point, handed out with a warning, taken by the fistful by men who had decided that if some was good, more was better. Medical doctrine on exactly how many and how often changed over the years as understanding improved. But the tablets were there, and the men took them, and the smart ones took them with a full canteen rather than on their own. The other answer was simply timing. You do not move at midday if you have a choice. You move early, you move late, you sit through the middle of the day in whatever shade you can find, and you accept that the middle hours belong to the sun, and there is no negotiating. Men who came from cold places had the worst of it in the first weeks. There is a process the body goes through when it moves into that kind of climate, adjusting how much salt it puts into the sweat and how fast it starts sweating at all, and it takes a couple of weeks, and it cannot be hurried. A brand new arrival, dropped into the field straight off an aircraft, was carrying the same load as the man beside him, with a body that had not yet learned how to survive it. Which is why the veterans watched the new men, not out of kindness particularly, because a new man going down in the heat was a stretcher the rest of them would have to carry. Now the feet, which is the one every single veteran mentions, and which sounds trivial for exactly as long as it takes to understand it. A boot in that country was wet, not damp, wet. It was wet in the morning from the dew on the grass, wet by mid-morning from crossing a stream, wet all afternoon from sweat, and wet all night from rain. In the paddies it was submerged for hours at a time, in water and mud that had been standing there since the beginning of the season. Skin that stays wet for long enough stops behaving like skin. It goes white and soft and swollen. It wrinkles in a way that does not go away, And then it begins to come apart in layers, and the tissue underneath is exposed to everything in the water, and it becomes painfully, comprehensively infected. The condition is old and has been known by different names in different wars. The men in Vietnam mostly called it immersion foot or paddy foot, and it was a genuine strategic problem, not an inconvenience. A man whose feet had gone that far could not walk. A man who cannot walk cannot be part of an infantry unit. He goes to the rear, sometimes for weeks. So the treatment was prevention, and the prevention was a ritual, and the ritual was enforced. Socks, dry socks, carried in a plastic bag or under the shirt to keep them dry, changed whenever there was a chance. The wet pair went over the pack or under the shoulder strap to dry in the air while walking, which mostly did not work in that humidity, but was done anyway, because the alternative was doing nothing. Foot powder issued and carried and used, and the inspection. In a great many units, at the halt, the men took their boots off, and the medic or the sergeant looked at everybody's feet. Not casually, properly, and a man who had been ignoring his feet was told about it in front of the others, because shame is a fast teacher, and there was no time for a slow one. Boots themselves changed during the war. The standard combat boot of the period was not designed for this, and a design better suited to the climate came into use with drainage and a different construction, and it helped, but nothing solved it. In the wet season, nothing could. The men simply managed it, day after day, with dry socks and powder and attention, the way you manage a chronic condition rather than the way you cure a disease. There is something almost tender in the image if you let yourself see it. A dozen exhausted young men sitting in a circle in the mud with their boots off, in silence, each one carefully drying his own feet with a rag, while one of them walks around and looks. The feet were the worst of it, but the same principle applied to everything the uniform covered. Warmth, moisture, and time are the three things a fungus wants, and a soldier in Vietnam provided all three in unlimited quantity for a year. So the men had fungal infections, nearly all of them, nearly all the time. In the groin, under the arms, between the toes, along the waist where the belt sat, anywhere two surfaces touched and stayed damp. They called it jungle rot, which was a catch-all term that covered several different conditions with different causes, and which described the experience accurately enough that no one needed a better word. There was also prickly heat, which is what happens when the sweat glands themselves get blocked and the sweat has nowhere to go, and which produces a rash that itches in a way that makes a man want to remove his own skin. And there were the sores, a scratch from a thorn, or from the edge of a sharp leaf, or from a can, or from anything, would not close. In a hot, damp environment, with dirt in everything, a small break in the skin becomes an infection quickly, and the infection becomes an ulcer that grows instead of shrinking. Men arrived with a scratch on the forearm and left the field 2 weeks later because the scratch had become a hole. The treatment was cleanliness, which was almost impossible, and dryness, which was entirely impossible, and antibiotics, which the medics carried and used more often for this than for anything dramatic. The single most valued luxury in that entire war, according to the men who were there, was not food, and it was not mail. It was a shower and a clean, dry uniform, and a base camp that could provide those things even once a month was a base camp that had fewer men out of action. Now the small crawling things, which killed almost nobody and tormented everybody. Leeches lived in the water and on the wet vegetation, and they attached without being felt, which is the part that unsettles people. A man would cross a stream, walk another hour, stop, open his shirt, and find them. On the legs, mostly. Sometimes higher. They are not dangerous in themselves. They take a small amount of blood and drop off. The problem is what they leave. A wound that keeps bleeding for a while because of what the leech puts into it, and which then behaves like every other break in the skin in that climate, which is to say, it gets infected. The men learned not to pull them off, because pulling can leave part of it behind and make the wound worse. The methods that worked were heat and repellent, a lit cigarette held close, or a drop of bug juice, and the leech lets go on its own terms. Then there were the ants, which found any food within seconds, and which came in varieties that bite hard enough to make a grown man swear out loud in a place where noise was forbidden. There were centipedes long enough to be genuinely alarming. There were scorpions in the dry ground, and in boots left out overnight, which is the origin of the habit every man learned in his first week. Shake the boot before your foot goes in it. Every time. For a year. Long enough that many of them still do it, half a century later, in a bedroom in Ohio, without thinking about why. And there were mites, which are the smallest of all of them, and by far the most consequential, because certain mites in that part of the world carry a bacterial infection that produces a serious fever. It is contracted in exactly the places infantry spend their time: tall grass, scrub, the edges of clearings, abandoned fields growing back. The men could not see the mite, could not feel the bite, and had no idea what had happened until the fever arrived a week later. It was treatable, and it was treated, and it filled hospital beds anyway. There is a story every American who served in Vietnam has heard, and it goes like this. There is a small green snake in the bamboo, and if it bites you, you take 2 steps and you are dead. They called it the 2-step snake, or the bamboo viper, and every unit had someone who swore it was true, and someone else who swore his cousin's friend had seen it happen. It is not true, in the neat way the story tells it. Vietnam has genuinely dangerous snakes, including several kinds of viper and the kraits and the cobras, and a bite from any of them is a serious medical emergency that requires anti-venom and speed. But the dramatic version, where a man takes 2 steps and falls, belongs to folklore rather than to medicine. What is interesting is why the story existed and why it lasted. A man walking through dense vegetation cannot see his own feet. He is putting his boots into places he cannot inspect, hundreds of times an hour, for hours, for months, and the mind does not tolerate that kind of blind repetition without inventing something to explain the fear. So the fear gets a shape and a name and a nickname, and the shape is a small green snake, and once it has a name, the fear becomes something you can joke about with the man behind you. That is what soldiers do with the unbearable parts. They give them a nickname and pass them around until they belong to the group instead of to the individual. Actual snakebite was rare. Fear of snakes was universal and permanent. Both of those facts are true at the same time, and the second one probably cost more sleep than the first one ever cost blood. The rats were not folklore. Where there are men, there is garbage, and where there is garbage in a warm climate, there are rats, and the base camps and fire bases of that war had them in numbers that people who have not seen it find difficult to believe. They lived in the sandbags. They lived under the floors of the hooches. They ran along the beams at night and dropped down, and men slept with their heads covered, and a certain number of men in that war were bitten while sleeping. The problem is not the bite. The problem is what a rat carries, which in that region includes a bacterial disease of the kind that has shaped human history more than any battle ever has. It was present in Vietnam during those years. It is treatable with antibiotics, and it was treated, and the number of American cases was small, and there was a vaccination program. But it was there, in the sandbags, in the same wall a man was sleeping against. The countermeasures were the ordinary ones: bury the garbage, burn what can be burned, keep food sealed and off the ground, trap where trapping was possible, bring in cats, which some units did, and which mostly resulted in a well-fed cat and an undiminished rat population. And the men adapted the way people always adapt, which is to say, they stopped noticing. Ask a veteran about the rats, and he will tell you it was disgusting, and then, in the same breath, tell you that after a month you slept through it. We keep coming back to the water, because everything came back to the water. There is an illness carried in water that has been contaminated by animal urine, which is a condition that describes virtually every flooded field, ditch, and slow stream in an agricultural country during a wet season. It gets into the body through broken skin, which every man had, or through the eyes and mouth, which are difficult to keep out of the water when you are wading chest deep. It behaves like influenza at first, which means it was often not identified immediately, and a man would be treated for something else while the real thing continued. And the paddies were unavoidable. They are the landscape. An infantry unit operating in the delta or the coastal lowlands spent a large part of its working life in water, up to the knee or the waist or higher, moving slowly in the open, which was tactically miserable and medically worse. Men came out of the paddies with everything the paddy had in it, on their skin, in their boots, in the cuts on their hands, in their eyes. And then they slept on the ground in the same trousers. I want you to notice something about this whole list, now that we are 8 items into it. Not one of these things is dramatic. There is no moment. There is no scene. Each one is a slow accumulation of ordinary discomfort that crosses, at some unmarked point, into being a medical problem. That is what made them so effective, and that is why they are not in any film. You cannot photograph a fever. You cannot put a wet sock in the 3rd act. The air had its own contents. In the dry season, the roads and the landing zones and the fire bases produced a fine red dust that got into everything, into eyes, into lungs, into weapons, into food, into the seams of clothing. Men described breathing it for days at a time and coughing it up in the evening and finding it in their ears. In the wet season, the same ground became mud, and the air became water, and everything the men owned developed mold within days. Leather grew a green coat, cloth grew a smell. Photographs sent from home stuck together and could not be separated. Books swelled, film fogged, and with the mold came the respiratory problems, particularly among men living in bunkers, which is to say, in a hole in the ground with sandbags on top, in a climate where the ground was saturated with no ventilation to speak of. A bunker is a shelter, and a bunker is also a damp box full of spores, and men slept in them for months. Then there was the smoke. Not from anything dramatic, from the burn barrels where the camp's waste of every kind was burned with diesel every day, downwind of somebody. Every man who was there remembers that smoke, describes it identically, and hated it. It got into clothing and hair and did not wash out, and it hung over base camps in the still air of the early morning. Nobody was measuring what any of that did to a set of lungs over 12 months. The instruments and the interest came much later. Here is one that nobody thought about at all at the time, and which followed a great many of those men for the rest of their lives. Nothing in that war was quiet, and nobody wore anything in their ears. Artillery firing over a fire base all night from a gun position 50 meters from where men were trying to sleep. Helicopters constantly at close range, with the rotor beat going through the chest rather than the ears. Weapons fired without warning at arm's length. Aircraft. Generators running day and night in base camps. Hearing protection existed as a concept. It was not distributed in any serious way to men in the field, and would not have been worn if it had been, because a man in the field is listening for his life, and voluntarily reducing his hearing is not a thing he is going to do. So they went home, partly deaf, in the specific pattern that noise damage produces, and many of them did not fully understand why for years. It is one of the most common lasting effects of that war, and one of the least discussed, precisely because it is not visible, and does not photograph, and cannot be shown in a scene. There is a version of this in every mechanized war since the invention of artillery. It simply took a long time for anyone to write it down as a cost. Now the load, which we have mentioned all night, and which deserves a direct look. A rifleman in the field carried his weapon and its ammunition, water, food, a poncho and liner, entrenching tool, first aid supplies, personal items, and then whatever the unit needed him to carry. Extra machine gun ammunition, mortar rounds, radio batteries, a claymore, water for the group, sandbags on some days. The totals varied enormously with the mission and the man, but the direction was always the same, which is up. New arrivals were routinely loaded heavier, because they had not yet learned what to leave behind, and because the senior men had learned exactly what to leave behind. That weight went on to a young spine, over uneven ground, in heat, for months. The immediate effects were the obvious ones: exhaustion, falls, twisted ankles and knees on ground that was never level. The delayed effects arrived 20 and 30 years later, in the form of backs and knees and hips that had been asked to do something they were not built to do, at an age when the body says yes to almost anything and sends the invoice much later. If you talk to a man who was in the field in that war and ask him what hurts today, he will not usually tell you a war story. He will tell you about his knees. I am going to handle this one carefully and briefly, because it is the least comfortable item on the list. In every war, a significant share of the harm is not caused by the enemy. It is caused by machinery, and by height, and by water, and by the sheer number of young, tired people operating heavy equipment in the dark. Vehicles turned over on bad roads and on the edges of paddies. Men drowned crossing rivers, weighed down by equipment, which is a specific and awful risk that anybody who has swum in clothing will understand instantly. There were falls, there were burns from stoves and fuel and generators, there were injuries from handling things that were not designed to be handled by people who had been awake for 30 hours. The Army knew the number and worked on it, and the effort produced the same result it produces in every large organization, which is that the number came down and never reached zero, because tired people and heavy machinery do not mix and never will. That is as far as we will go into that one. It is on the list because it belongs on the list. We are not going to dwell there. We spent a whole night on the food, so tonight we will only take the medical corner of it. A man in the field ate what he carried, which was sealed, salted, and unchanging. He ate it in a climate that suppressed his appetite, while working harder than he ever had, while frequently ill. The result was that men lost weight, steadily, over months. Not dangerously, in most cases, just constantly. They went into the field at one size and came out at another, and the photographs from the beginning and the end of a tour often look like two different men. With the weight went some of the resilience. A body that is running a deficit heals more slowly, which matters when everything in the environment is producing small injuries. The scratch that will not close, the sore that grows, the infection that takes hold, all of that is easier for the environment to accomplish against a man who is quietly running out of fuel. And in the accessory packet, 3 times a day for most of the war, there were 4 cigarettes, included, free, as part of the meal. Nobody at the time thought of that as an item on this list. It was simply what was in the box. The cost of that decision, for that generation, was collected quietly over the following 40 years by an entirely different set of doctors. And now, appropriately, we arrive at sleep, which was the thing they did not get, and the thing that made everything else worse. The arithmetic of a night in the field is brutal and simple. Somebody has to be awake. In a small position with a handful of men, that means each man takes a watch of an hour or 2, which means his night is cut into pieces. Add stand 2 before first light and after last light, when everyone is awake regardless. Add the noise, the insects, the wet, the ground, the heat that does not fall much after dark in the lowlands, and the specific quality of alertness that comes from being somewhere you might be attacked. A man in that situation is not sleeping badly. He is barely sleeping at all, and this goes on not for a night or a week, but for months. What chronic sleep deprivation does to a human being is now extremely well documented, and none of it is good. Judgment degrades before the person notices. Reaction time slows. Mood collapses. The immune response weakens, which loops directly back to every single item we have discussed tonight, because a tired body is a body that catches things. The men managed it the way people always do, which is by taking sleep in fragments wherever it appeared. 20 minutes leaning against a pack, an hour in the back of a moving truck, a doze in the shade at the halt. Veterans of that war describe an ability, learned there and never lost, to fall asleep completely in about 90 seconds, anywhere, in any position, in any amount of noise. That is a strange skill to acquire at 20 and to keep for the rest of your life. Their wives noticed it. Their children thought it was funny. And there is something almost gentle in the idea that the men who were given the least sleep of anyone became permanently the best sleepers you will ever meet. Everything on this list ran through one person, and he was usually about 20 years old. The medic carried the unit's medical supplies on his back, in addition to everything else, and the supplies for this list were not dramatic. They were antibiotics, foot powder, antifungal cream, salt tablets, water purification, malaria tablets, bandages, tape, and a great deal of patience. The overwhelming majority of what he did day to day was exactly this: feet, skin, fever, stomachs, cuts that would not close. He inspected, he cleaned, he applied, he nagged, and he decided who needed to go to the rear and who could be managed where he was, which was a genuinely difficult judgment made by a very young man with limited information. His unit's regard for him was total, and it came out of this ordinary work far more than out of anything dramatic. He was the person who looked at your feet. Every army in history has this figure, and almost nobody outside the unit ever learns his name. Malaria was not evenly spread across that country, and where a man served mattered enormously to what his year was going to feel like. The coastal lowlands and the delta had their own problems, which were mostly water and mud and heat. But the fever country, the serious fever country, was the high ground, and the forest along the western side, the mountains and the plateau, and the border regions where the vegetation is heavy, and the streams run clear and cold, and the mosquito that carries the worst form of the parasite is at home. A unit that operated in the mountains for a month came out of the mountains with fever cases, reliably, every time. Commanders planned for it the way they planned for ammunition consumption, as a known cost of operating in that terrain. There is a grim symmetry in this that the men noticed. The high ground is where you want to be, tactically, in almost every situation in the history of warfare. It is also where the fever was. So the ground that gave you the advantage was the ground that took your strength, and you paid for the view. The men who spent their tours in a base camp near the coast, or on an airfield, or in a supply depot, mostly did not experience this. Their year had different miseries: boredom, heat, the burn barrels, the same food, but not the shaking. And this created one of the many invisible divides inside that army. Two men, same country, same year, same uniform, one of whom spent his tour in a place where fever was a fact of life, and one of whom did not, and neither of them entirely able to explain their year to the other. The mosquito net deserves a section of its own, because it is a small object that reveals the whole problem. In a fixed position with a cot, a net is straightforward. It hangs from a frame, it tucks under the mattress, and it works, and a man under a properly rigged net sleeps unbitten in a room full of insects. In the field, none of the conditions that make it work are available. There is no frame, there is no cot. There is often no way to hang anything, and even where there is, a man inside a net on the ground is a man who has added several seconds to the time it takes him to be ready, and several seconds is the entire margin in a night ambush. So, the net went in the pack, and stayed in the pack, and men lay in the open and got bitten, and took their chances with the pill. Some units and some individuals used a hammock, particularly in terrain where the ground was permanently wet. A hammock gets you off the ground and away from what crawls, and it keeps you out of the water, and it is drastically more comfortable than mud. It also puts you in the air at a fixed height, visible in silhouette, unable to move quickly, in a position that cannot be dug in. Which is why American infantry in that war mostly did not use them in the field, while the other side, operating differently, used them constantly. Two armies, same forest, opposite conclusions about the same piece of cloth. Both conclusions were correct for the way each of them fought. We have talked about the iodine in a man's canteen. Let us look at the other end of that system, which was industrial. Water for a base camp did not come from a tap, because there was no tap. It came from a river or a well, through a purification unit, into storage, and out to the units, and every part of that chain was somebody's full-time job. The equipment was a mobile purification set that could be moved by truck or slung under a helicopter, and it did what a small municipal plant does in a field using chemicals and filtration, run by soldiers trained specifically for it. Around it there was always a water point, and the water point was one of the busiest places in any base area. Distribution to the field went by trailer and by can. The trailer was a round tank on wheels that the entire army in every war for decades has called a water buffalo, for reasons that become obvious the moment you see one being towed across a field. Cans went out on the resupply aircraft alongside the ammunition and the mail, and every step of that chain was a place where the system could fail. A hose lying in the mud, a tank not cleaned, a can filled from the wrong source by somebody in a hurry, a unit that ran out and improvised. The preventive medicine people tested constantly and reported unpleasant results regularly, and the reports went to commanders who had 11 other priorities, and the water mostly got better over the course of the war because somebody kept writing the reports. That is how these things actually improve. Not through a moment, through a person with a clipboard, being tiresome. For years, the human body can adapt to heat. It is one of the more remarkable things about us, and it takes about a week to 10 days of exposure and effort. What changes is not willpower, it is chemistry. The body begins to sweat sooner and to sweat more, and crucially to put less salt into the sweat, conserving what it cannot afford to lose. Blood volume adjusts. The heart rate at a given workload comes down. A man who has been through that process is genuinely a different machine from the one who stepped off the aircraft, which is why the first 2 weeks were the most dangerous 2 weeks of many men's tours, in a way that has nothing to do with the enemy. A new arrival came from an American winter, or from an air-conditioned barracks, into a place where the air was a wet blanket and was given the same load as everybody else, and frequently a heavier one, and told to walk. His body had not begun to adapt. He did not know how much to drink because he had never needed to know. He did not recognize the early symptoms because he had never had them. So he went down, and the unit, which had seen it before, carried him and his equipment and was not especially sympathetic about it. The Army understood this and tried to manage it with orientation periods and graduated introduction to the field, with varying success depending on the year and the unit and the operational situation, which is a polite way of saying that the requirement to adapt gradually and the requirement to be somewhere tomorrow morning did not always agree, and the process had to be repeated. A man who spent 2 weeks out of the heat, on leave, in a hospital, on a rear job, lost some of what he had gained and had to earn it back. We should be honest about the paddies because they come up in every account and are usually described only as wet. A rice paddy is a managed shallow pond, flooded deliberately, worked by people and animals, and fertilized by whatever is available in a farming economy that has been operating in the same place for a very long time. In that region and in that period, what was available was animal waste and human waste, used as fertilizer in the completely ordinary way that has fed most of humanity for most of history. So the water in the paddy was not clean, in a specific and consequential way, and every man who waded through it knew what he was standing in. Now add to that the small breaks in the skin that everybody had, the scratch on the shin, the blister that opened, the place where the boot rubbed. That is the whole mechanism. That is how a great many of the infections in that war got started, and it required no enemy action at all, only a farmer doing what farmers there had always done, and a young man from Ohio walking through his field. The men came out of a paddy, and, when there was time and clean water, they washed. When there was not, which was most of the time, they simply dried and carried on and hoped. The clothing was its own chapter in this story, and it changed during the war because the first version was wrong. The uniform the early arrivals wore was designed for a temperate climate. It was heavy. It held water. It dried slowly. In an environment where a man was soaked every day, that was not a minor design flaw. It was a medical problem, because wet cloth against skin for weeks is how the skin condition started. So, a different uniform was developed and issued, lighter, cut for the tropics, in a fabric that dried faster without the unnecessary layers, with pockets placed where a man could reach them while wearing equipment. It went through several versions during the war as the feedback came back from the field. It was a genuine improvement, and everybody who had worn the old one said so. The men modified it further, the way soldiers always do. They cut things off. They removed anything that held water, and a great many of them stopped wearing underwear entirely, which sounds like a joke and is, in fact, one of the more practical medical decisions of the entire war, because underwear in that climate stayed wet against the exact areas most prone to fungal infection, and going without it kept those areas drier and the infections down. The medics endorsed it. It was, in many units, effectively official. There is something perfect about that. In a war fought with helicopters and computers and chemical laboratories, the most effective intervention against one of the most common medical complaints was to wear less. Which brings us to washing, which was the most desired thing in that country and the hardest to arrange. In a base camp there were showers, sometimes proper ones with a water point and pipes, more often a tank on a frame, filled by hand or by trailer, warmed by nothing except the sun, with a chain to pull. A man stood under it for as long as he was allowed, and then put on clean clothing, and the veterans described that specific moment with a kind of reverence that food never quite gets. In a fire base, there might be a version of the same thing, improvised, depending on water supply. In the field, there was nothing. There was a stream, if a stream happened to be there, and the tactical situation allowed it, which was rare. There was rain, and men stood in it deliberately with soap when it came, which sounds pleasant and was for about 4 minutes, until the rain continued for another 6 hours. And there was the helmet. A steel helmet with the liner taken out is a basin. It holds water. Men shaved out of them, washed out of them, and washed clothing in them, and it is one of the small, unglamorous pieces of genius in the design of that piece of equipment, which was never advertised as a sink and functioned as one for 2 generations. Clean clothing came out from the rear when it came, and it came dirty again within an hour. But for that hour, a man in a clean, dry uniform in that country felt, by every account, like a completely different human being. I will treat this next one factually and briefly, because it is unpleasant in the ordinary way rather than the disturbing way, and because leaving it out would make the whole picture dishonest. Where several 100,000 people live in temporary camps in a hot climate, waste is the central engineering problem, and it was solved differently, depending on the size and permanence of the position. In the field, it was a hole and a shovel, sighted away from water, and moved when a unit stayed anywhere long enough to matter. In fixed positions, the standard arrangement of that era involved cut drums under a latrine, which were removed daily, and the contents burned with diesel fuel by a detail assigned to the job. That detail is one of the most universally remembered duties of the entire war. Every veteran of a base camp knows what it was. Most of them did it at least once. Usually as a punishment or as a rotation, nobody escaped. And the smoke from it is part of the smell of that war that we talked about earlier. It sounds crude. It was also, for the conditions and the technology available, an effective way of preventing exactly the diseases we have been discussing all night. In a place with no sewage system and no possibility of building one. The alternative was cholera and dysentery on a scale that would have stopped operations entirely. So, a 19-year-old stood in the sun with a stick and a can of diesel, and that unglamorous hour was, in strict medical terms, one of the more consequential things anybody did that day. It was not only the men. The same environment was working on everything they owned constantly, and the effort to keep equipment functioning was an enormous hidden labor. Weapons rusted, not slowly. In that humidity, a rifle left uncleaned for a day showed it, and a rifle left uncleaned for 3 was a problem, which is why cleaning was obsessive and ritualized and enforced, and why every veteran can still describe the process in order without pausing. Ammunition corroded in its links and in its magazines. Radios failed from moisture. Batteries lost their charge sitting in the damp. Optics fogged internally and stayed fogged. Boots rotted. Leather grew mold in days. Canvas grew mold in less. Photographs stuck to each other. Letters from home went soft and tore. Books swelled to twice their thickness and then dried into something that could not be closed. Vehicles fought a permanent war against mud and water and the red dust that got into every moving part in the dry season and turned into grinding paste the moment it met oil. And aircraft, which were the whole basis of how that war was fought, required a level of maintenance in that climate that is difficult to overstate, performed by mechanics working in the open, in the heat, at night, under lights, for the hours the aircraft was not flying. I mention all of this because it makes the human part easier to understand. If the climate could do that to steel and glass and rubber in weeks, then what it was doing to skin and lungs and feet over 12 months stops being surprising. Nothing in that country was designed for that country. Not the uniforms, not the boots, not the vehicles, not the radios, and not the young men from temperate places wearing and carrying and driving all of it. There is a detail that comes up in almost every honest account, and that nobody puts in a film, and it belongs here at the end of the list, told quietly. A man in the field did not wash for as long as the operation lasted. After 30 days in the bush, wearing the same uniform, in that heat, in that mud, a human being smells in a way that is difficult to describe to anybody who has not encountered it. The men knew it about themselves and about each other, and it stopped registering after the first week because everybody was in the same condition. Where it registered was on the aircraft, on the way back. A crew that had been living in a base camp with showers would open the door for a unit coming out of the field, and there would be a moment, and it registered in the rear, where a man walking into a mess hall after 4 weeks in the bush cleared a space around himself without saying anything. The veterans tell that story with a particular kind of laugh, and there is something in the laugh besides humor, because the smell was the physical proof of where they had been, and the people who reacted to it had not been there, and both parties understood exactly what was being communicated in that moment. It would be wrong to leave you with the impression that all of this simply happened to the men while the Army watched. The Army fought this list hard, with money, with people, with organization, and with a degree of scientific effort that most people would find surprising if they knew about it, because none of it produced a photograph anybody wanted to publish. There were preventive medicine units whose entire job was this: not treating the sick, preventing the sick. They surveyed base camps and fire bases, identified standing water, identified where the rats were breeding, tested the water supply, checked the kitchens, checked the latrines, checked the drainage, and then wrote reports telling commanders things commanders did not want to hear. They sprayed. Aircraft and ground equipment put insecticide over base areas on a schedule, targeting the mosquito at the stage of its life when it is still in the water and cannot fly away. They drained. Engineers filled and graded and ditched, because a puddle that exists for 10 days is a mosquito factory, and a puddle that drains in 1 day is not. They screened. Mess halls got screens. Hospitals got screens. Sleeping quarters in fixed camps got screens. And somebody had to inspect those screens, because a screen with a hole in it is a decoration. They inspected the ice plants and the bakeries and the local vendors in an effort that was partly medical and partly diplomatic and never entirely successful, because a soldier who wants a cold drink at a stand outside the gate is going to buy it, regardless of what any report says. They ran a vaccination program of considerable scale. Men arriving in country had already received a series of shots and received more while they were there, against a list of diseases that reads like a 19th century mortality table. The plague vaccine was part of that program in a war where plague was genuinely present in the local population, which is a sentence that sounds medieval and was simply a fact of the medical situation in the 1960s. And they studied. There were research laboratories working on exactly these problems during the war, in that country, on the specific local strains and the specific local conditions, because the malaria they were fighting was not behaving like the malaria in the textbooks. That last point is worth dwelling on for a moment in a calm voice, because it is one of the more interesting things in this entire subject. Malaria had been fought before, in other wars, in other tropical places, with drugs that worked. Then, in the region that includes Vietnam, the parasite changed. Strains appeared that the standard drug could no longer handle reliably. The men were taking their Monday pill as ordered and getting sick anyway, which is a demoralizing thing to discover and a serious operational problem. So, the response was a drug development program run through military medical research that tested compound after compound for years, looking for something the new strains had not learned to survive. That program eventually produced results that went far beyond the war and are still in use in the world today, in places that have never heard of any of the battles we have been naming. It is a strange legacy. Of everything that came out of that war, one of the most durably useful things is a set of anti-malarial compounds developed by an army for its own soldiers because a mosquito had outmaneuvered it. The men in the field knew none of this, of course. They knew there was a pill on Monday and that it upset their stomachs. The same climate was working on the other army, and it did not have any of the answers we have just described. The North Vietnamese soldier and the Viet Cong fighter lived in the identical environment, in the same water, under the same mosquitoes, with the same mud and the same heat, for years at a stretch, rather than for a single 12-month tour. And their medical supply was a fraction of what the Americans had. Malaria among them was, by every account written afterward, catastrophic and constant. Units moving south along the supply routes through the mountains passed through some of the worst malarial country in the region, on foot, carrying loads for weeks or months, and arrived in the south having lost a significant part of their strength to fever before ever encountering an American. Memoirs and diaries from that side describe the fever the way the Americans describe the mud, as a permanent condition of life rather than an event. Men shaking in hammocks in the dark, whole groups too weak to move for daz, quinine and whatever else could be obtained, rationed carefully, given first to those who could still be saved by it. Their answers were the ones available to people with no supply chain. Hammocks strung off the ground rather than sleeping on it, which is better protection than it sounds. Smoke from the cooking fire, which discourages insects. Herbal remedies, some of which had real pharmacological value and some of which did not, and an extraordinary tolerance for continuing to function while ill, because there was no rear area to be sent to. Their food deficiency problems were worse than the American ones by a wide margin. Their skin conditions were the same. Their feet were the same. Their water was the same water. I'm not telling you this to make a point. There is no argument being made tonight. It is simply that the environment does not take sides, and any honest account of what was killing people quietly in that country has to include everybody who was standing in it. Two armies in the same mud, being worked on by the same mosquito. One of them had a pill and a helicopter, the other had a hammock and a herb. Both of them shook with the same fever in the same darkness, and neither of them slept. Here is one that almost never comes up, and that a surprising number of veterans will mention if you ask them directly. Teeth. A young man arrives in that country with whatever dental condition 20 years of life has produced, which in that era, in that population, was frequently not good. Then he spends a year eating a high-sugar diet out of cans, drinking sweetened powder, chewing gum from the accessory packet with limited water, no reliable way to brush, and no routine dental care within reach. The result is exactly what you would predict. Dental problems in the field were common, and a bad tooth is not a minor thing when you are 8 kilometers from a road. It is pain that does not stop, that interferes with sleep, that interferes with eating, and that can turn into an infection that puts a man in a hospital. The Army knew this and dealt with it in 2 ways. Before deployment, there was dental work, sometimes a great deal of it, done quickly and not always gently, on men who had never seen a dentist regularly in their lives. Some of them received more dental care in the weeks before shipping out than in all the years before. And in country, there were dental facilities in the larger base areas and mobile dental teams that moved to smaller ones, working in tents and in the backs of vehicles. A man in the field with a bad tooth had one option, which was to endure it until a resupply aircraft could take him back. Men did that for days. Some did it for weeks. Ask a veteran about the worst pain he experienced in that country, and a certain percentage of them, without any hesitation, will tell you about a molar. The eyes had their own quiet war. The dry season delivered dust, constantly, in a fine red form that behaved almost like smoke. It got under eyelids, it scratched, and it produced infections that spread easily through a group of men living close together with dirty hands. The wet season delivered water that was not clean, into faces, repeatedly. The sun in the open, on water, in the paddies, was relentless, and sunglasses were not standard issue for everybody in the way you might imagine. And then there were the men who needed glasses. The military issued corrective spectacles, and it issued them in a frame that was designed for durability and cost, rather than for the self-esteem of a 19-year-old. The men had a nickname for them universally, across services and across decades, and the nickname is affectionately obscene and refers to how effective those glasses were at ensuring the wearer would not be reproducing any time soon. They were tough, they were replaceable, and they were mocked without mercy. A man who broke his in the field was in genuine trouble because a rifleman who cannot see is a liability, and the replacement came in when it came in. Contact lenses were not a practical answer in that dust and that water, for reasons anybody who has ever had grit under a lens will understand immediately. So, a certain number of the men who fought that war did it in the ugliest eyewear ever mass-produced by any government, and were photographed in it, and are still being teased about it at reunions half a century later, and the hands which took the small daily damage that nobody counts. A man's hands in that country were cut constantly, from the vegetation, which in that part of the world includes grasses with edges that behave like blades, from wire, from the sharp lid of a ration can opened in a hurry, from metal on vehicles, from sandbags, which sound soft and are not, because filling several hundred of them in a day with an entrenching tool takes the skin off the palms of anybody who is not already calloused, burns from stoves and from heat tabs and from the exhaust of running machinery, blisters that opened and filled with dirt, and every one of those small injuries lived in the same environment as everything else on tonight's list, which is to say, warm, wet, and full of bacteria. So the small injuries did not behave the way small injuries behave at home. They lingered, and a certain proportion of them became infections, and a certain proportion of those became the reason a man went to the rear. The medics fought this with the least glamorous item in the bag, which was a bottle of antiseptic and a roll of tape, applied to a cut on a hand, at the halt, in the mud, several times a day, for a year. That was the war, most of the time. Antiseptic on a hand. Let us go back to sleep for a while, because it is the item on this list that produced all the others, and because we are here in the dark, doing exactly the thing they could not. Picture a small position at last light, 6 men, or 8, or 12, a perimeter that is more of a suggestion than a line. Everybody has dug in as much as the ground allows, which on some ground is a lot, and on other ground is almost nothing. Somebody has to be awake. That is not negotiable and never has been in the history of soldiering. So, the night is divided. If there are 8 men, and the night is 10 hours long, and 2 men are awake at any moment, each man is on watch for 2.5 hours. That does not mean he sleeps for 7.5, because his watch is in the middle, which cuts his night in 2, and because he has to be woken for it, and because being woken and then going back down is not the same as sleeping through. Add the listening post, which is 2 or 3 men placed outside the perimeter in the dark, further out, alone, with a radio, whose job is to hear anything approaching before it reaches the position. That duty is the least popular in the entire infantry, and for excellent reasons. Add stand to, before first light and after last light, when every man is awake and in position regardless of the rotation. Add the rain, which arrives without asking and soaks a man in his poncho on the ground. Add the insects, which we have discussed at length. Add the ground itself, which is hard where it is dry, and a swamp where it is not, and the roots, and the slope that gradually slides you downhill through the night. Add the temperature in the lowlands, which does not fall enough after dark to bring relief, and add the specific quality of listening that a man does in that situation, which is not the same as ordinary rest even when his eyes are closed. That is a night. There were 365 of them, and out of that arithmetic came the tiredness that made a man careless with his feet, and forget his salt tablets, and skip the 30 minutes of waiting for the iodine because he was too tired to care, and not notice the scratch on his forearm until it was something else. Everything on tonight's list runs through the sleep. That is the thread. Take a young body and remove its sleep for a year, and every other item gets easier for the environment to accomplish, which is a slightly strange thing for me to be telling you at this hour, while you are lying down with the lights off in a room where nothing is going to happen. You have that. They did not. Let us sit inside one of those watches for a moment, since we are both awake anyway. And since it is the part of the night nobody ever describes, it is 2 in the morning. Somebody's hand comes out of the dark and touches his boot, which is the agreed signal because speaking is not done. He is awake instantly, in the way that men in that situation learn to be awake instantly, with no soft part in between. He sits up. His uniform is wet, because it has been wet since yesterday afternoon, and will be wet tomorrow. There is a moment of working out where he is, and then it arrives, and it is the same place it was 4 hours ago. He takes the watch. Sometimes there is a literal watch handed over, an actual timepiece that is the platoon's, and gets passed from man to man through the night, which is why the phrase means what it means. And then he has 2 hours in which he must not fall asleep, and must not move, and must not make a sound. That is a very specific kind of time. It does not pass the way ordinary time passes. He cannot read. He cannot listen to anything. He cannot get up and walk around. He can look at a piece of darkness that does not change, and listen to a wall of insect noise that does not change, and stay in exactly one position because shifting his weight makes a sound. So he thinks that is all there is. For 2 hours, every night, for a year, a 19-year-old sits perfectly still in the dark with nothing but his own mind, and there is no way to turn it off and no way to leave. Every veteran describes those hours the same way, and the descriptions are strangely gentle. They thought about food, constantly, and in enormous detail. They planned meals they would eat in 11 months. They thought about a girl, or the absence of one. They ran through the layout of their parents' house room by room. They did arithmetic, counting days, dividing what was left by what was done, arriving at the same numbers they had arrived at the night before. And they listened. That is the part that never fully switched off afterward. 2 hours a night of concentrated listening in a place where a sound might matter, repeated 300 times, wires something into a person. A great many of them came home and discovered that they could not stop doing it. A noise in the house at 2 in the morning, and they were fully awake instantly in that same hard way, 40 years after the last time it meant anything. There was also the cold in the highlands and in the northern provinces during the wet months, which surprises everybody who has only heard that Vietnam was hot. A wet man sitting motionless at 3 in the morning at altitude gets genuinely cold, and shivering is a sound, and he cannot do anything about either. And at the end of it, when his 2 hours were finished, he reached out into the dark and touched the next man's boot, and lay back down in the same wet uniform on the same wet ground, and had perhaps 2 hours left before the sky started to change. That is what was being subtracted every single night from every one of them. Not sleep in the sense of a bad night. Sleep in the sense of the thing a body uses to repair itself, taken away in half portions for 12 months, while everything else on this list worked on him. It is the reason the list works. Take away the repair, and everything else gets to keep what it takes. Let us open the bag, slowly, because it is the summary of everything we have said. The unit medic carried, in addition to his own weapon, water, food, and equipment, a canvas bag that weighed a great deal and contained almost nothing dramatic. Bandages of several sizes, tape, antiseptic, antibiotics in the form the period used, in quantity, because infection was the daily enemy. Antifungal preparations, in tubes, used more than anything else on the list. Foot powder, salt tablets, water purification tablets, because men lost theirs. Malaria tablets, because men lost those too, and because he was often the person who made sure they were taken. Something for pain, something for stomachs, which was requested constantly. Morphine in the specific quantity and under the specific control that the period required, for the situations we are not discussing tonight. Tags and paperwork, and, in the pockets of every medic who had been there more than a month, an assortment of things that were not on any list. The cigarettes he did not smoke, kept to give away. A spare pair of socks that was not his. Hard candy, a bottle of hot sauce, whatever the men in his unit had complained about most recently. That last category is not medical supply. It is something else, and every unit understood exactly what it was. His day was ordinary and endless. Feet in the morning, skin at the halt, somebody's stomach, somebody's hand. The new man who has not been drinking enough and does not know why he has a headache. The old hand who has been hiding a fever for 2 days because he does not want to leave his friends. The argument about whether a particular man is going to the rear, which the medic wins, because on that specific question his authority is absolute and everybody knows it. And then his own night watch, like everybody else, because he was also a soldier. Every man on this list had a first day, and they all describe it the same way. The aircraft comes down. It has been cooled inside for 18 hours. The door opens, and the air comes in. That is the moment. Every single account of arriving in that country contains that moment, and the men who were there use almost identical words for it. The air did not feel like air. It felt like something with weight that had to be pushed through, that got into the lungs and sat there. Men described stepping out of the door and feeling as though someone had put a wet towel over their face. And with the heat came the smell, which is the second thing they all mention. Aviation fuel and burning waste and vegetation and cooking and mud all at once, and unmistakable and never forgotten. Veterans say that if you put them on that runway, blindfolded 50 years later, they would know where they were within one breath. Then the walk across the tarmac in a uniform that was correct for the country they left and completely wrong for the one they had arrived in, carrying a bag, sweating within 30 seconds, into a processing area with a fan. And there, waiting, was the other half of the arrival, which is the men going home. The aircraft that brought the new arrivals was the aircraft that took the finished ones back, and the two groups passed each other on the same strip of concrete. One group is pale and clean and heavy, in fresh uniforms, looking around. The other group is thin, dark from the sun, in faded clothing, looking at nothing in particular, waiting to board. Nobody in either group has to be told which is which, and the veterans, on their way out, almost always said something to the new arrivals, and what they said was usually a joke. And the joke was always about how long the new men had left. That is day one. The body has just begun a process it will not finish for 10 days. The lungs have taken their first breath of the air they will breathe for a year. Every item on tonight's list is now, quietly, in progress. We talked last night about the packages from home and what was in them. There was a medical version of that, and the families worked it out themselves without anybody explaining it. foot powder in quantity, sent because a son had mentioned his feet once in a letter, and a mother had understood immediately. Socks, always, in numbers that would be comic in any other context, and were exactly right in this one. Vitamins, sent by parents who had read something. Antifungal cream from a drugstore, which was frequently better than what was available in the field, and which was shared around a squad until the tube was empty. Hand lotion, which sounds absurd, and was requested constantly, because hands that are wet and then dry, and then wet again for months, crack open. Aspirin in bottles, lip balm, talcum powder, and the drink powder, which we discussed, which did more for actual hydration than anything else on this list, because a man will drink 2 more canteens of water if it tastes like grape, and will not if it tastes like iodine. There is a whole invisible logistics chain in that. Somebody in a kitchen in a small town, reading a letter, deciding that what her son needs is powder for his feet, and buying it and packing it with the cookies and sending it 8,000 miles. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands of households. The Army had preventive medicine units and laboratories and spray aircraft. It also had mothers, and the mothers were not the less effective half of that arrangement. One correction to something I said earlier, in the interest of getting it right. In the Army, the man who does that job is called a medic. With the Marines, the man who does exactly the same job is a Navy corpsman, because the Marine Corps takes its medical personnel from the Navy, and has done for a very long time. The men called him Doc, both services universally, regardless of the paperwork. His position within a Marine unit was, if anything, even more particular than the medics within an Army one, and the affection and protectiveness that Marines direct at their corpsmen half a century later is something you notice immediately at any gathering of them. Same bag, same feet, same fungal cream, same 20-year-old, same nickname in both services for the same reason, because when a man is on the ground and hurting, he does not shout a rank or a name. He shouts for the one person who might be able to do something, and what comes out is one syllable. And one last item, which is not medicine, and which the men would tell you belongs on any honest list of what kept them functioning. Letters. A mail delivery to a field position was the single best thing that happened in any given week, and its absence was the single worst. Men who had gone a month without a letter, because the mail had not caught up with a unit that kept moving, described that as one of the hardest things about the entire year. It is not measurable, and it does not belong in a medical report. But every person who has ever studied groups of people under prolonged stress arrives at the same unremarkable conclusion, which is that the ones who feel connected to somebody outside the situation endure it better than the ones who do not. The Army understood this perfectly well, and moved mail with a priority that surprises people who assume ammunition came first. It did not, always. Sometimes the mailbag went on the aircraft, and something else waited, because a commander had decided that his men needed the letters more than they needed the other thing that day. That is a medical decision in its way. It simply was not written down as one. We have not mentioned the flies, and we should, because every account mentions them, and because they connect directly to the water and the stomach. Where there is waste and food and heat, there are flies, and a base camp in that climate had them in a density that people who have only encountered a fly in a kitchen at home find hard to imagine. They were on the food while it was being served. They were on the tray while a man was eating from it. They landed on the rim of the cup between one sip and the next. A fly is not a nuisance in that situation. It is a delivery system. It walks on the waste, and then it walks on the bread, and the chain from one to the other is measured in seconds. The countermeasures were the ordinary ones, and they were pursued seriously. Screens on the mess halls, covers on the food, spraying, traps, attention to how far the latrines were from the kitchens, which is a boring question, with a very unboring answer if you get it wrong. The kitchens themselves were inspected, and the cooks were watched, and the men who prepared food for hundreds of people in canvas tents in tropical heat were held to a standard, because an outbreak in a mess hall could take 100 men off duty in a day. And when it went wrong in the way it always goes wrong, which is suddenly and to everybody at once. Every large base in that war had at least one story of a bad night in the mess hall, followed by a long queue at the latrines the next morning, told afterward as comedy, taken very seriously indeed at the time by the people whose job it was to find out which item had done it. Outside almost every base there was an economy, and one of the largest parts of it was laundry. Local women took uniforms, washed them, and returned them for a small fee, on a schedule, and the arrangement was universal, and was the reason a great many soldiers had clean clothing at all. The washing was done in whatever water was available, which in some places was a river, and in others was a well, and in others was exactly the same water we have been discussing all night, which meant that the uniform that came back beautifully clean and neatly folded had also been rinsed in the same environment that everything else in this story lives in. Preventive medicine noticed. There were efforts to control it, to designate approved facilities, to check the water. The effort had limits, because the alternative was a soldier washing his own uniform in a helmet, and he was not going to do that if there was a woman at the gate who would do it properly for the price of a pack of cigarettes. It was not a major source of illness compared with the rest of the list. It belongs in the account because it is a perfect small example of the shape of the whole problem, a system that was solving one problem, cleanliness, by way of a route that quietly reintroduced another, and because it is a reminder that the war ran on the labor of a very large number of civilians whose names nobody wrote down, doing ordinary work every day in the middle of it. Let us follow a man who has finally gone down with the fever, because the week that follows is a strange one, and it is the closest thing to rest that many of them got. He is flown out, usually in the afternoon, on a helicopter that was going that way anyway. He arrives at a hospital that is, by the standards of what he has been living in, a palace, a building, or at least a proper structure with a floor, with electricity, with fans, with screens on the windows. He is given a bed, an actual bed, with a frame and a sheet. And then, for the first time in months, nobody needs anything from him. He sleeps. That is the first thing every one of them describes. Not the treatment, the sleeping. A man who has been taking his rest in 90-minute pieces on the ground for 4 months is put in a bed in a room with screens on the windows and told that his only job is to lie there. And he goes under like a stone and stays there for the better part of 2 days. Then the fever runs its course with the help of the drugs, and he begins to feel human, and the boredom starts, and he discovers that the hospital is full of men in exactly his situation, and they talk. He eats food from a kitchen. He drinks water he did not have to purify. He is clean and dry, and stays that way. And underneath all of it, in almost every one of them, there is the same complicated feeling, which is guilt, because his unit is still out there, and he is not. and the man who took his place is carrying his load. Which is why the most common thing hospital staff dealt with, apart from the illness itself, was men trying to leave early. For the men who went into the tunnels, there was an item on this list that nobody else had to think about: air. A tunnel system dug by hand into clay, with limited ventilation, occupied and cooked in and lived in, develops an atmosphere of its own. The air in the lower levels could be extremely poor. It was hot, it was still, it was saturated, and the oxygen in a dead end at the bottom of a shaft was not what it is at the surface. Men working down there described headaches within minutes, and a heaviness, and the specific disorientation that comes from breathing air that is not doing its job. Add a flashlight consuming oxygen, add exertion, add the fact that a man in that situation is frightened, which changes his breathing. There were also the ordinary hazards of a hand-dug hole, collapse, and the things that live underground in a warm country, which include snakes and bats and everything associated with bats, and the diseases that come with all of that. The men who did this work were selected partly for size, and were, by universal agreement, a specific kind of person. The rest of the unit stood at the entrance and waited and did not envy them. I mention it in this program because it is the purest example of tonight's theme. Nobody was shooting at a man who fainted from bad air at the bottom of a shaft. The environment simply did what environments do quietly, without intent, to somebody who had gone where a human body was not designed to go. The sailors and the riverine soldiers had a version of this list that was all their own. They lived on boats, on rivers, in the same climate, which meant they were wet in a slightly different way. Not the intermittent soaking of the infantry, but a permanent proximity to water, with spray, with humidity, with decks that never dried. Skin conditions among boat crews were, by the accounts, at least as bad as in the infantry, and in some units worse, because the men had fewer opportunities to dry out completely, and because the boats were small and crowded, and everything on board stayed damp. They had the same mosquito problem, with an interesting difference. They were often moored at night, on the water, in exactly the environment where the insect breeds. They had a specific hearing problem, from engines and from weapons fired in a confined space over metal decks. They had heat, in a way that was worse than the infantry's in one respect, because a steel or aluminum boat sitting in the sun becomes an oven, and the crew has nowhere else to be. And they had one advantage that the infantry envied bitterly, which is that they slept on the boat, in the same place most nights, with their equipment nearby, and could sometimes cook properly, and did not have to carry any of it on their backs. Every branch in that war was certain that its own arrangement was the worst one. All of them had a case, and the air crews briefly, because their version is different again. They lived in base camps, which meant showers and beds and mess halls, and the infantry never let them forget it. But their working environment was its own set of exposures, noise at a level that makes everything discussed earlier look mild, in an aircraft, for hours a day, for a year. Fumes from fuel and from hydraulic fluid, in an enclosed space, constantly. Vibration, at frequencies the human spine has opinions about. Heat in a cockpit sitting in the sun on a pad, which is genuinely extraordinary, followed by a fast climb into cold air and back down again several times a day, and a schedule that ran on demand rather than on a clock, which meant sleep in fragments for them as well, just in a nicer bed. The lasting consequences most commonly reported by that group are the ones you would predict from that list: hearing, backs, and the long-term effects of a decade of chemicals that nobody in that period thought of as a hazard because everybody was standing in them. None of what we have described was constant. It came in seasons, and the seasons in that country do not arrive politely. The country is long enough that the weather in the north and the weather in the south are running on different schedules, which meant that a man's experience depended on where he was as much as on when. In the south and in the delta, the wet season runs through the middle of the year, and when it arrives, it does not arrive as rain, in the way that a temperate country understands rain. It arrives every afternoon, on a schedule you could set a watch by, in a volume that turns a road into a river in 20 minutes, and then stops, leaving everything standing in water and the air completely saturated. In the far north of the American area, the pattern is reversed, and the heavy months are the ones at the end of the year and into the winter, delivered by a different weather system, arriving with a persistent cold drizzle rather than a daily downpour, along with a genuine drop in temperature that surprised everybody who had been told they were going to a hot country. That drizzle produced the specific misery that the men in the northern provinces describe. Not heat, but being permanently wet and genuinely cold, in equipment designed for the tropics, sleeping on saturated ground for weeks. And in the dry season the whole equation flips. The mud becomes dust. The paddies become cracked plates. The streams that were the water supply become a thin trickle or nothing. The heat goes up, and the illnesses shift with it, away from the ones that live in water, and toward the ones that ride in the air and the dust. Nobody got the good version. Each season took away one set of problems and handed over another, and the men rotated through both of them in a 12-month tour, and could tell you afterward which one they hated more, and the answer was always the one they were in most recently. When somebody on this list finally went down, there was a system waiting, and it was one of the better pieces of organization anybody built in that war. It started with the medic, which we have discussed. Behind him was the battalion aid station, which is a doctor and a small team in whatever structure was available, handling the cases the medic could not manage, and sorting who needed to go further. Behind that were the field hospitals of several types and sizes, some of them remarkably well equipped, placed close enough to the units that a helicopter could reach them quickly. And behind those was evacuation out of the country entirely, to facilities in the region, and then, when necessary, home. For the list we have been discussing tonight, most of the traffic stopped at the second or third step. A man with a fever went to a hospital, was treated for a week or two, and was returned to his unit. A man whose feet had come apart went back, was kept dry and treated and returned. A man with an infection that had gone too far for a medic's antibiotics went back, was dealt with properly, and returned. That word, returned, is doing a lot of work, because the thing that made these illnesses so operationally significant is not that they killed men. Mostly they did not. It is that they removed men in large numbers for periods of 1 to 3 weeks, constantly, at random, from every unit, all year. A rifle company at full strength on paper was almost never at full strength in the field, and the gap was very often not a casualty gap. It was a fever and a foot and a stomach and an infection, 4 men in a hospital coming back next week or the week after. Commanders in that war spent an enormous amount of their attention on that arithmetic, and it never appears in any film about it. The scout dogs shared everything on tonight's list and had their own additions. A dog in that heat, working wearing a coat it cannot remove, is in a permanent struggle with its own temperature, and heat was the single largest threat to the working dogs of that war. The handlers carried water for them, rested them deliberately, kept them in shade at halts, and watched them the way a medic watches men. They picked up ticks and the diseases ticks carry. They had skin conditions from the same water. They cut their paws on the same ground, and a dog cannot tell you that it is limping for a reason. And there was a serious disease in the region that struck the military dogs of that war particularly hard, and which produced a veterinary effort of its own, with laboratories and treatment programs, because a working dog was an expensive and irreplaceable piece of the unit. The handlers, who slept next to their dogs and shared their food with them despite instructions, describe watching an animal go down with fever in the same tone the men use when they describe a friend going down, which tells you everything about that relationship that needs saying. Since we are talking about sleep, and since you are probably close to it, let us go through the sounds of a night in that country the way a man lying on the ground would have heard them. The insects first, which are not a background noise there, but a wall of sound, rising and falling in waves, so loud in the deep forest that men had to speak up to be heard, and so constant that it stopped being noise and became the shape of the silence. The frogs, in the wet season, in numbers. The geckos, which produce a call that sounds startlingly like a rude word repeated several times, which every man in that country learned within a week, and which produced the same joke in every unit for 10 years. The rain on a poncho, which is not a gentle sound at close range. It is static, at volume, 6 inches from your ear. The artillery, from a firebase somewhere behind, firing all night on pre-planned targets, which arrived as a distant thump and then, much later, as a faraway rumble, and which men learned to sleep through so completely that the silence when it stopped would wake them. Aircraft, high up, going somewhere, the man on watch, moving slightly, and the small metallic sound when he did. And the other thing, which is the sound a man's own mind makes at 2 in the morning in a place where he is not safe, which no recording has ever captured, and which every one of them would recognize instantly. That was the soundtrack of a year of nights. Compare it, gently, to the room you are in right now. Whatever is around you at this moment, it is not that. There is nothing in your dark that requires anything from you. Once during a tour, a man got a week away. It went to places outside the country, to cities where a young soldier could be in an air-conditioned hotel room within a day of having been in the mud. Clean sheets, a bath, food that arrived on a plate, a bed that did not require anybody to stay awake. The medical effect of that week was real and measurable in a way nobody bothered to measure. A body that has been running a deficit for months gets 7 days of sleep, clean water, real food, and no exertion. It repairs. Skin conditions cleared up in that week. Weight came back. The permanent low fatigue lifted. And then the man got on an aircraft and went back into the environment and lost most of it again within 2 weeks. And there was something in that arrangement that men found harder than not going at all. A number of veterans say exactly that. The week itself was wonderful, and the return was the worst day of the year. There was also the shorter version, an in-country rest area on the coast, with a beach and a bar and a barracks for a few days rather than a week. Less dramatic, and possibly better for the same reason. Shorter drop from the top back down to the bottom. One thing we should say plainly, because it is easy to describe a country as a collection of diseases and forget that people lived there. Every single item on tonight's list was a normal feature of life for the population of that country, and had been for centuries. Malaria was endemic. The water carried what it carried. The paddies were fertilized the way they had always been fertilized. The rats were there, the mites were in the grass, the heat was the climate. The difference was that the local population had lived with all of it from birth, with the partial immunities and the practical habits that a community develops over many generations, and the Americans arrived as fully grown adults with no exposure to any of it and no habits, and were put to work outdoors in it immediately. That is the whole medical story of that war in one sentence. Not that Vietnam was uniquely dangerous, that it was ordinary for people who had grown up there and completely foreign to everybody who was flown in. It is also why the effort we described earlier, the spraying and the draining and the testing, was aimed at the American installations rather than at the country. Nobody was going to change the ecology of a nation. They were going to make a few hundred base camps slightly less hospitable to a mosquito, and hope. There is one more thing that belongs on the list, and it lives in the mind rather than the body. A man in that war knew exactly when he was leaving. He had a date. He had known it from the first day. And as the date came closer, something happened to almost every one of them. They called it being short. A short-timer was a man with a small number of days remaining, and the culture around it was elaborate. Calendars marked off, countdowns announced at every meal, a specific and universal joke format about how short a man was. Underneath the joking there was a real and observable change in behavior. Men in their final weeks became careful in a way they had not been before. They took fewer chances. They thought harder about small decisions. Some of them were pulled off dangerous duties by their own sergeants, quietly, in the last stretch, in an act of collective superstition that everybody participated in and nobody discussed. The relevance to tonight's list is this. Those same men, in those same last weeks, also became meticulous about their feet and their water and their tablets. A man who had spent 11 months being careless with all of it would suddenly be the most disciplined person in the platoon, because the finish line was visible, and he was not going to be beaten by a mosquito with 3 weeks left. There is something very human in that, and every one of us would do the same thing. Before we finish, let us go back over the whole thing once, slowly, the way you would count something to fall asleep. The mosquito at night, in the highlands, carrying the fever that filled more hospital beds than anything else. The pill on Monday, handed out at the chow line and swallowed under supervision. The bug juice, sharp and chemical, on the hands and therefore in the food. The water in the stream, in the crater, in the paddy, in the well. The 2 iodine tablets and the 30 minutes of waiting that nobody wanted to wait. The taste of a swimming pool with a coin in it, in the coffee, in the cocoa, in everything. The ice at the stand outside the gate, bought anyway, every time. The heat that could not evaporate the sweat, and so took the water without giving any cooling in return. The salt, going out with the sweat, taking the strength with it. The salt tablets in the bottle at the water point. The 10 days a body needs to become a different animal, and the new man who had not been given them. The boot that was never dry, the white swollen skin that comes apart in layers, the dry socks under the shirt and the wet pair drying on the pack, the circle of men with their boots off, in silence, in the mud, the fungal infections in every place where 2 surfaces touched, the scratch that would not close, the leech in the stream not felt found later, the ant, the centipede, the scorpion in the boot, the habit of shaking the boot out, kept for 50 years, The mite in the tall grass, too small to see, carrying a fever a week away. The snake that everybody feared and almost nobody met. The rat in the sandbag wall and the men sleeping against it. The mud in the paddy and what the farmer had put in it, and the cut on the shin. The red dust in the dry season, breathed for weeks. The mold in the wet season, on the leather, on the letters, in the lungs. The smoke from the burn barrels, which every one of them still remembers. The guns firing all night beside a sleeping head, and no protection for anyone's ears. The 60 pounds on a 20-year-old spine, and the invoice arriving 30 years later. The machinery in the dark, operated by people who had not slept. The weight coming off, month by month, quietly. The 4 cigarettes in the box, 3 times a day, free, and the sleep. The night cut into pieces, the watch in the middle. The listening post further out in the dark. The stand to before light. The rain, the insects, the ground. That is the list. There is one more item, and it is the least tangible, and I want to put it gently because it deserves care. Being mildly unwell for a year is its own condition. Not sick enough to be evacuated, not well. A low fever that comes and goes. A stomach that is never quite right. Feet that hurt. A rash that itches. A cut that will not close. Fatigue that sleep does not fix, because there is no sleep. Constant low-grade discomfort every day for 12 months, on top of everything else that was happening. That does something to a person that no medical report of the period was measuring. It wears down patience, it shortens tempers, it makes small decisions harder and large ones worse. It makes a man less able to absorb anything else that arrives. The men described it, when they described it at all, in very plain language. They said they felt rotten most of the time. That was the whole description, and it covered a year. And then they came home and were asked what it was like, and there was no useful way to say any of that at a dinner table, so most of them said it was hot. Most of this stopped when the aircraft left the ground. The fever did not come back for most men. The feet healed. The fungal infections cleared up within weeks of being dry and clean. The weight came back, usually with interest. Some of it did not stop. The form of malaria that hides and returns brought a number of men a very unwelcome reminder months after they had gone home. In a suburb, in winter, in a place where the doctor had never seen a case. The hearing did not come back, because it does not. The backs and the knees arrived on schedule 20 and 30 years later, and the sleeping stayed strange for a great many of them, in ways that had nothing to do with any of the items on tonight's list, and which is a different subject for a different night, told carefully by somebody qualified to tell it. Let us do one last pass, and this time follow a single body through 12 months, because the list does not arrive all at once. It arrives on a schedule. The first 2 weeks belong to the heat. The body is doing its adaptation, and until it finishes, everything is harder than it will ever be again. This is when men go down, carrying loads they will carry easily in November. This is when the headaches are worst. Nothing is wrong with him, except that he is the wrong animal for this place temporarily. Weeks 3 and 4 belong to the stomach. He has now drunk from enough sources, eaten from enough hands, and bought enough ice at enough stands, and one of them has found him. He spends several days learning things about himself he would rather not know, and comes out the other side with a permanent respect for the iodine tablets he was skipping. The second month belongs to the feet and the skin. The novelty has worn off, and so has the vigilance. He has been wet for 6 weeks. The rash arrives. The place between the toes stops looking like skin. The medic notices before he does and says something, and he starts changing his socks properly. The 3rd and 4th months are when the fever tends to find the ones it is going to find, particularly if the unit has been in the high country. He goes to a hospital, sleeps for 2 days, comes back thinner, and is quietly proud of the fact that he did not want to stay. Somewhere in the middle of the year is the low point, and every account agrees on this. It is far enough in that the novelty is long gone, and far enough from the end that the finish line is not visible. His weight is down. Something on him is always infected. He has not slept properly in 5 months. He is not in danger particularly. He is simply worn thin. That is also, in most men's telling, when he became genuinely good at the job. The two things arrive together, and nobody has ever fully explained why, although anybody who has been very tired and very competent at the same time will recognize the state. Months 8 and 9 bring the accumulated wear, old injuries that have not healed, the knee that has been sore since a fall in the 2nd month and is still sore, the ear that has not been right since the artillery, the stomach that never entirely returned to normal, and the last 2 months bring the carefulness we described earlier, and with it a strange improvement. He is taking his tablets. He is drinking properly. He is looking after his feet with the attention of a man polishing something valuable. In many cases, he ends his tour in better condition than he was in at the middle of it, purely because he decided to pay attention. Then the aircraft, and the tarmac, and the new arrivals looking around, and someone makes the joke about how long they have left, and a body that has spent a year being quietly worked on by an entire environment gets on a plane and flies out of it, and begins, over the following weeks, to repair almost all of it. Almost. So, that is the quiet list. A mosquito, a cup of water, the sun, a wet sock, a damp uniform, a leech, a mite in the tall grass, a rat in a sandbag wall, a flooded field, red dust in the dry season and mold in the wet one, a gun firing all night beside a sleeping man's head, 60 pounds on a young spine, a machine in the dark, a slow subtraction of calories, 4 cigarettes in a box 3 times a day, and no sleep for a year. None of it makes a scene. All of it made a hospital bed. And here is the last thought, and then I will let you go. Every single item on that list was ordinary. Not one of them was designed by anybody as a weapon. The mosquito was not sent. The water was not poisoned. The mud was simply mud, doing what mud does, in a country where it had been doing it for 10,000 years before anyone arrived, and where it carried on afterward. The men who went there were not defeated by any of it. They managed it. They took the pill and changed the socks and shook out the boot and waited the 30 minutes for the iodine and did that every day for a year, and then came home and mostly never mentioned any of it because it didn't sound like a war story. It was, though. It was most of the war. The pill is taken, the socks are dry, the boot has been shaken out, and there is nothing in it. And if you are still with me at this hour, do one small thing before you drift off. Tap the like button and subscribe so the next one finds you tomorrow night. And tell me in the comments where you were listening from. It costs you nothing, and it is the whole reason this channel can keep going. Sleep well. I will be here again tomorrow night with something else that takes a long time to say.